The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. 96.9 FM in Baton Rouge. Welcome to the show, everybody. All the throngs of people in Baton Rouge and around the world listening on WHYR.org. We're glad to have you here tonight for a topic that has been really stuck in my craw, so to speak, ever since 2003. And you may be able to guess what that might be based on the year. But anyhow, tonight's topic is going to be the history of Iraq and the country of Iraq, or Iraq, depending on how you pronounce it. But Lang Baker, as always, is here with me as well, co-hosting. Good evening, Lang.
Howdy, Wayne.
Appreciate the work you've done to get ready for this. And basically, I, as far as the history of Iraq, I'd like to cover, well, when it was created as a country, really, because all of that, its creation, the reasons for its creation, right on up through our invasion of it in 2003 was all about pretty much one thing, and we'll get to that. But anyhow, to start off, Lang, I thought I'd mention this article I looked at from the Smithsonian magazine, Smithsonian.com, their online stuff, and it states here that well, we did cover. Never mind. Let me just read this. For nearly 400 years prior to World War I, the lands of Iraq existed as three distinct semi-autonomous provinces within the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the Ottoman Empire, as we've discussed before, was basically out of Turkey, and it covered good portions of southeastern Europe and northern Iraq as well, I believe. And they were overthrown and divided up after World War I by the European powers. But it states here that by the end of World War I, the three areas in Iraq were governed by three religious or ethnic groups that predominated in the region: the Shiites, the Sunnis, and the Kurds. And they had the veneer of Ottoman rule resting atop a complex network of local clan and tribal alliances. And this delicate system was undone by the West for an all too predictable reason: oil. And this is the Smithsonian magazine, which is fairly reputable as far as I know, anyway. And you mentioned something about there being oil control by the British prior to World War I, right?
Yeah, one of the sources I came across was referring to the British-controlled Turkish Petroleum Company under the Ottoman Empire, where the British had concessionary rights in the Mosul region, which is in northern Iraq now, and was Ottoman, part of the Ottoman Empire.
So when
at the time the British first obtained oil concessions there.
Right. So before the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany in World War I, Britain was friends with them, and was there involved in getting oil.
Right. According to this source.
Yeah. Okay. So this Smithsonian article goes on to show that once Iraq was created, its history would be marked by a series of violent coups and rebellions, with its political domination by the Sunni minority simply deepening its sectarian fault line. After repeatedly intervening to defend their fragile creation, the British were finally cast out of Iraq in the late 1950s, and their local allies were murdered by vengeful mobs. Bummer. But okay, so now 1950, in the late 50s anyway, and I think you had the date, the British-supported regime or whatever was booted out.
Yeah, well, the Brits were in there as a ruling power from the end of the First World War up through 58, more or less. First as a mandate power, and then de facto control under an ostensibly independent monarchy. And that transition was in 32, and then the monarchy was overthrown by a coup in 58.
Okay, and to get back to my point about it being a loose, Iraq originally being not a defined country, but three regions each governed by distinct groups. There's a really great book on the Paris negotiations in 1919 when the European powers got together and divided up the Ottoman Empire and all the other former powers that were related to the Germans, who they were able to defeat at that time. And Margaret Macmillan wrote a great book, Paris 1919, about those discussions. The subtitle is 6 Months That Changed the World, and indeed it did. But Macmillan talks about, in the chapter regarding Iraq, she says that a guy named Arnold Wilson, who was a British political officer, called for Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul to be regarded as a single unit. And Macmillan stated in her book, quote, "It never seems to have occurred to him that a single unit did not make much sense in other ways. In 1919, there was no Iraqi people, history, religion, or geography. Everything pulled the people apart, not together." And then later in the chapter, she quotes Lord Curzon, who was the British Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and was involved in dividing up that part of the world. He says, quote, "Coal had been the great fuel of the Industrial Revolution, but by 1919 it was becoming clear that oil was the fuel of the future." And he went on to state that the Allied cause floated to victory upon a wave of oil. So we had the Turkish oil company that Britain was involved in for the oil, obviously, before the war, and then after the war, when they're dividing everything up, oil is very prominent in their calculations too. And an aide to Lord Lloyd George, another negotiator for the British, stated that the greatest oil field in the world extends all the way up to and beyond Mosul, and even if it didn't, we ought, as a matter of safety, to control sufficient ground in front of our vital oil fields to avoid the risk of having them rushed at the outset of a war. So I think that establishes right there that the whole basis for creating Iraq and forcing these three regions together under one government was for oil, for control of the oil. Anyway, I wanted to make sure I made that clear. So now, let's move on, okay? They've been created by the British, and now there are a series of struggles and strife and coups and everything else as the three different powers, the Shias, Sunnis, and Kurds, struggle to gain some kind of advantage over the others. And you've got some details on those, I think. And somewhere in there, Saddam Hussein and the Baathists were involved, and they started getting the upper hand, huh?
Yeah, according to the sources that I was reading, we start with the British monarchy, the monarchy that was supported by the British, the independent monarchy in Iraq, overthrown in a coup in 1958 by Brigadier General Qasim was his name. And
Qasim, yeah.
And then there were attempts to overthrow him, and he was eventually overthrown in a coup in 1963 that the Ba'athist Party was involved in, but they didn't come out on top after the coup was completed and executed.
Okay, I'd like to stop right there if I can.
Sure.
Because I haven't yet fulfilled my responsibility to remind the listeners that this is a live call-in show. Feel free to call in and voice your thoughts, objections, or ask questions. 343-9927, 343-9927, if you'd like to call in and join the discussion. And okay, Lang, so in 58 you said General Qasim overthrew the government and took over. He was an Iraqi general.
Right, and from what I read, the Ba'ath Party assisted in that coup, and some Ba'ath Party members, leaders in the party, were appointed to his cabinet, but shortly afterwards he kicked them out of the cabinet and had them arrested, and some of them fled the country.
Okay, and this is the coup of 58.
This is the coup of 63 that
okay.
overthrew
That overthrew Qasim, okay.
Yeah, this was a Colonel Arif in February 63.
Okay, and I have some information on that from, well, several places I found it, but the one article I brought was from the Independent of the United Kingdom, dated July 28th, or June 28th, 1997. It states here, well, it carries the headline, Revealed, How the West Set Saddam on the Bloody Road to Power. And it starts out by stating that it was the CIA's favorite coup, and they quote James Critchfield, who was the head of the agency in the Middle East, the head of the CIA agency in the Middle East that organized the coup. They quote him as stating, "We really had the T's crossed on what was happening. We regarded it as a great victory." And the article goes on to state that the Iraqis have less happy memories of the day in 1963 when the Iraqi army rose in revolt. It was a coup which shaped the history of Iraq and much of the Middle East for the rest of the century. And it started Saddam Hussein on his climb to power. And states here that this is interesting because we've talked about Iran and the coup that we and the British organized there in 1953. This article states here that Iraqis have always suspected that the coup was engineered by the CIA in much the same way that the agency had restored power to the Shah in Iran in 1953. And then it goes on to detail, and I don't need to read all that stuff, but this article details how the CIA basically planned and fine-tuned this coup in '63, and also made up the list of the people that were going to be murdered by the new regime once they got into power. And again, I guess Saddam Hussein was involved in that, all that stuff somewhere in there, according to this, or the Baathists were, and he was a player in there.
Yeah, well, according to one source I read, Saddam Hussein was also involved in an earlier attempt to overthrow Qasem in '59. See, Qasem came to power in '58. In '59, the Baathists were trying to assassinate Qasem, and they had a plan where some of the Baathists were going to shoot the folks in the front seat of the car and some in the back seat of the car, and
Hussein
Saddam
blew it.
started shooting prematurely, and it botched the whole deal, and Qasem survived, and Saddam fled to Egypt in '59 and lived there until '63.
Right, that's it, yeah. Yeah, because I got that right here. At the end of this article from The Independent, it states that the CIA decided to use the Ba'ath Party, a nationalist grouping with just 850 members but with strong links to the army. In 1959, a party member named Saddam Hussein, aged 22, had tried to assassinate General Qasem in Baghdad but had been wounded in the leg, and I guess that's when he ran off.
Yeah, he fled to Egypt, and there was some speculation without supporting evidence to date, according to this source, that pointed the finger at Gamal Abdel Nasser as being behind that plot to assassinate Qasem.
Yeah, and that's entirely possible. Like you were mentioning before, Hussein didn't want to get involved in the
United Arab Republic, the unification of Egypt and Syria, and the Ba'athist Party did want that greater United Arab Republic with a nationalistic and a socialistic orientation.
Yeah, because as we've talked before about the other countries in the Middle East that we've discussed, when the European powers began divvying up all this, all the Arabs were like, hey, we want control of our own land. And they were rebelling against these protectorates that the Europeans were creating.
Yeah, the sense of nationalism was rising, not just in what were the parts of the Ottoman Empire at that time, but also within nationalist groupings, national identity groupings within the Austro-Hungarian Empire that was also broken up by that First World War.
Right. Okay, so now we've got the Baathists gaining control in Iraq, and we're talking 1963 or so now, right?
Well, the Baathists were involved in the '63 coup, but this source says that shortly after the coup, the Baathists were kicked out of Arif's government and were arrested, and some of them had to flee the country again.
Okay.
At that point.
All right. And then, what was the next coup that occurred?
Well, in 1968, there was a bloodless coup that overthrew the brother of Arif, who was also an Arif, who had taken over after the Colonel Arif, the coup instigator of '63, after he died. And so in '68 is when the Baathists finally came to full control of the government, and Saddam Hussein was a major participant in that government behind the scenes, and then becoming more and more powerful within until he was second in charge. He was a general and second in charge, and that was from '68 up till around 1979 is when, at that point, you know, Saddam Hussein had done a lot to implement programs to help his people and improve the services under the nationalist socialist orientation, the Arab nationalism and the socialist orientation that Gamal Abdel Nasser and the UAR were promoting. And then the president of this Ba'athist regime, who was getting old, was facing a proposal from Syria to make treaties where the Syrian president would become the deputy, and then Saddam, who was number two, would fade into obscurity, or so he thought, according to this source, and that's when he prevailed upon al-Bakr to resign in 1979, and Saddam became president of Iraq in 79.
And I suppose it was coincidence in 1979 when Saddam Hussein took over as president of Iraq. That was also the same year of the Iranian Revolution, when they rose up and kicked the British out, kicked the Shah out, who, of course, the Shah had already left for cancer treatment in America. But then they discovered that the United States, or found proof that the United States had been responsible for placing the Shah in power in '53, and so they took a bunch of our embassy personnel hostage at that point. But at this point, I think the United States began looking rather favorably on Saddam Hussein as an ally in the region. In fact, I've seen quotes of that where they actually said that our shift in policy in support of Hussein was primarily because of, or totally because of, the Iranian Revolution.
Yeah, from what I was reading, right after Saddam Hussein, or shortly after he assumed the presidency of Iraq, the Iranian Revolution occurred, and also there was concern by Hussein about Iranian influence to cause uprisings within Iraq.
In favor of the Shias, right?
Yeah, because these sources said that the Ayatollah Khomeini had been exiled and took up residency first in Iraq, and then the Iranians prevailed upon him to expel Khomeini, who then went to France. And also, Hussein was happy to do this because Khomeini in Iraq was calling upon the Shiites in southern Iraq to rise up against the central authority in Iraq. So he was under threat from this orientation, this ideology, even before the Iranian Revolution. So
right.
Once the Khomeini came back after the revolution and assumed power in Iran.
I wanted to clarify that when the Iranians urged Saddam to kick Khomeini out, or whoever it was that was at power when he kicked them out, when Hussein was kicked out, not Hussein, Khomeini, that was the Shah's power. That was the Shah's government in Iran. That he wanted to get rid of Khomeini. Yeah. Okay. I want to make sure that because the Iranians love Ayatollah Khomeini. He was a Shiite cleric. And but it wasn't the Iranian people that were in charge of the government at the time. It was the Shah.
Right, it was the Shah who wanted him out of Iraq because he was so close to foment.
Sure, and
he was also fomenting an uprising against the Ba'athist government in Iraq.
Yeah. Okay. So now we have the Shias, and by the way, I did glean somewhere in one of these articles that the Ba'athist Party was largely Sunni, and that was a sticking point for the Shias, obviously.
Yeah. One of these sources was saying that back when the British were there before '58, the military was getting stronger, and which was part of what the British treaties provided for. And when they said they had the kingdom set up, and then they also had the military set up, and within the military, the Sunnis were the officers because they had been like the magisterial class and the officer class under the Ottoman Empire. And the foot soldiers, the lower enlistees in the army, were the tribal fighters who were the Shia, according to this source.
Right.
And so there was that split within the military.
Yes, and I'm jumping ahead briefly here, but when we allowed Maliki to be the first elected president of Iraq, He was a Shia, staffed his government almost entirely with Shias, and purged the military of Sunnis, and it set the stage for the mess that's there now, really. But
Yeah, well, that was under, from these sources, under the regime that was put in under the American.
right, I think that was Nuri al-Maliki, but I'm not sure. Maliki,
Well,
but I'm not sure.
I'm just thinking of the first two orders that came down by the administration by the Americans after the 2003 invasion. The first two orders was to disband the army, which were mostly Sunni, and to prohibit anyone who was a member of the Ba'athist Party to have any positions
And that
in
scared.
government, which included people who one point here was that like 14,000 teachers in the country who had to join the Ba'athist Party just to have their jobs.
Right.
Well, then immediately they couldn't have a job anymore.
Yeah.
And so they lost all your teacher profession.
Yep. No. Well, yeah, and we'll get to that hopefully. By the way, I'd like to remind everyone that's listening. You're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought. We're discussing the history of Iraq and the involvement of oil, the European powers, the United States, and all the bloodletting that has gone on over there in all of our attempts to control oil. And you can feel free to call in and share your thoughts, questions, or objections to anything we're talking about here. 343-9927, 343-9927. And before we go further, I did want to mention one thing, Lang. I know I tend to beat up on our government for its involvement, but in reality, in areas like this, but in reality, I really think we had no choice. What irks me the most is that we've been lied to so much, and our troops have been lied to so much over the years, over the decades, for so many of our wars. But in his book, The Prize, Daniel Yergin, The Prize, his book was an award-winning, very extensive history of the oil industry, the oil business. The first discovery of oil right up into the early 80s, when we were friends with Saddam Hussein. And he was the one that labeled oil a strategic asset. So, and countries wanted control of oil, not just because they needed it. Some countries that wanted control didn't need it, but whoever controlled a large portion of oil in the world controlled all of the developed world. And so it's like Yergin said, it's a strategic asset. So anyway, Hussein is in power now, 79. The Iranian Revolution kicked us and the British out of Iran. The Ayatollah Khomeini took over, and Saddam Hussein decided he was going to invade Iran. And he was looking for the Shat al-Arab waterway, I believe. He wanted control of that, which was in Iran, right? That would have given him access to the sea, to the Persian Gulf.
Well, Iraq has a Basra down there on the Gulf.
Oh, they are on the Gulf there? Okay. Well, he wanted that waterway for some reason, though. But was it the oil?
there were. I'm not sure on that.
Okay.
I know that's where the first fighting was, over that small area. In the first couple of years, it kind of went well for the Iraqis, and then the Iranians just overwhelmed them with numbers.
Yes, and that's where this next article I have from the Guardian of London. You ever wonder why we don't have major American papers that are breaking stories like this? And but anyway, the Reagan administration. This is an article from 2002, December 2002, from the Guardian of London. Julian Borger in Washington states that the Reagan administration and its special Middle East envoy Donald Rumsfeld did little to stop Iraq developing weapons of mass destruction in the 1980s, even though they knew Saddam Hussein was using chemical weapons, quote, almost daily against Iran. And they stated here that the U.S. provided less conventional military equipment than Britain or German companies, British or German companies, but it did allow the export of biological agents, including anthrax, vital ingredients for chemical weapons, and cluster bombs that were sold by a CIA front organization in Chile. This was based on a CIA report, I believe, but I don't see the authors of that. But basically, once the tide began to turn against Saddam Hussein, we began helping him arm with with weapons of mass destruction to fight against the Iranians. Did you see any of that? Or
I came across an article in Foreign Policy that was published back in 2013, and it's relying on CIA files that had been released showing that the CIA was aware of all this going on and the chemical strikes that were taking place, and in spite of this they were supplying information to the Iraqis about where the Iranian troops would be, including aerials and
Yeah, well, there was a major surprise offensive being planned by Iran that we became aware of, and we informed Saddam about that, and he, knowing full well he was going to use chemical weapons because he'd been using them the whole war, and he went ahead and thwarted the Iranians' attack with chemical weapons, by buying dropping bombs on them. I had a couple more facts here from this article from The Guardian. In a 1994 congressional inquiry also found that dozens of biological agents, including various strains of anthrax, had been shipped to Iraq by U.S. companies under license from the Commerce Department. Furthermore, in 1988, the Dow Chemical Company sold $1.5 million worth of pesticides to Iraq, despite suspicions that they would be used for chemical warfare. And I was reminded by Marine General Smedley Butler's famous speeches, and I think he wrote the book, War is a Racket, where major corporations were making fantastic amounts of money on supplying arms to both sides in most of our wars. And in fact, America was providing missiles to Iran at one point with the Iran-Contra thing. But anyway, what I wanted to try to reach with this, what we're talking tonight, Ron Lang. So if you would, let me move on a little bit. After 8 years and fighting to a stalemate in the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam Hussein pulled out. He gave up and just pulled his troops back, and there was peace and quiet for a while. But then he began raising a stink about Kuwait and low oil prices in the world. And this is where I have speculated all along, and I've had my eyes opened and my mind changed as a result of getting ready for this show. But the way I saw it was, okay, we helped Hussein obtain weapons of mass destruction because we didn't want Iran to prevail in this conflict. But now that the war was ended in stalemate, we had this powerful dictator in Iraq who hated Israel, who had all these terrible weapons. And just, and I guess one of the things that helped form my suspicions was the Iraq's invasion, or the prelude to Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. I think that was in August. And you and I talked about this before, but there's a transcript of an interview between the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, and Saddam Hussein regarding his intentions about Kuwait. And the way I read it is Glaspie was very conciliatory, but she told Hussein that she was instructed to find out what his intentions were with massing all of his troops on the border with Kuwait. And he basically said that we would like to keep all of Shat al-Arab, which is the waterway I was mentioning, and also, which is in Iran, we will make concessions to the Kuwaitis if we can get that. He basically told Glaspie that if they could get that waterway, then they wouldn't take all of Kuwait. But if they couldn't, they would take all of Kuwait. And she responded, and I'm quoting here from the deal. He asked her opinion about that. He said, "What is the United States opinion on this?" And Glaspie says, "We have no opinion on your Arab conflicts, such as your dispute with Kuwait. Secretary of State James Baker has directed me to emphasize the instruction first given to Iraq in the 60s that the Kuwait issue is not associated with America." And at the time, this caused a great deal of outrage in America because it sounded to everyone that Glaspie had given the green light to Hussein to go ahead and invade Kuwait. The only sticking point was they hadn't expected him to take the entire country. But of course, that's not confirmed. That's just, what some of the evidence shows. But anyhow, that's what caused us to invade Iraq and cause Saddam Hussein to get rid of his weapons of mass destruction. In fact, the CIA conducted a report, and the report was by the Iraq Survey Group, and this was published on the CIA's website. It states here that by 2001, Saddam had managed to mitigate many of the effects of the sanctions and undermine their international support. He wanted to get rid of the sanctions so he could start rebuilding his weapons of mass destruction. But it states that Saddam wanted to recreate Iraq's WMD capability, which was essentially destroyed in 1991. So the CIA right there stated that his WMD capabilities were shot after our invasion. So then why did we invade in 2003 when we knew that he had already got rid of his WMDs or buried them? In fact, everything they found that were WMDs were old stuff that had been buried in the ground since the first Iraq War. But anyway, we're getting close. We got a couple of minutes, it looks like, Lang, I think.
A couple of points about Kuwait. Some of the reasoning around that was they were the country of Iraq was in such terrible economic shape after that long war with
Iran, yeah.
Iran, and they had a lot of debt from armaments and things that they were purchasing in pursuing that war, that they wanted Kuwait to forgive the debt they had to Kuwait, and also Kuwait was not abiding by production limits, and so the price of oil was low, and so Iraq was having trouble raising enough money through selling its oil to rebuild its country, and so they were in dire financial shape, and they laid that blame at the feet of Kuwait, and so that was part of it. Another aspect on Kuwait was the monarchy back in 1932, when the British first gave full power to the monarchy in Iraq. One of the first things they did was they demanded Kuwait, because Kuwait had been part of the Basra region under the Ottoman Empire, and so they regarded Kuwait as part of that segment of Iraq. And so this was being reasserted from days of the Ottoman Empire by the monarchy, and then again by Hussein, when he was claiming and tried to incorporate Kuwait as the 19th portion of whatever their local divisions of government are within Iraq. So
One more
that piece of it too.
One more link to the past that started the chain of events that brought us up to where we are today in Iraq. But Lang, thanks a bunch for your research for tonight, and everyone, you've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. A pause for thought. We thank you for listening. We got to go. You have a good night.